Before I start today's video, I just want to take a moment to thank anyone who's subscribed to my channel. Also note that you can now follow me on Twitter with the link at the top of the channel page or the link in the video's description. I also want to thank anyone who's ever shared any of my videos by retweeting them or posting them elsewhere on social media. You don't have to do that, but when you do, you help my channel to grow, and I appreciate it because I try my best to provide everyone with unique and interesting content. So if you could take a moment to subscribe or follow me on Twitter if you like my content, I'd really appreciate it. Anyways, that's enough out of me. Enjoy today's video. Number 2. Frane Selak. Frane Selak was born on June 14th, 1929 in Croatia. Until he was 32 years old, Selak lived a normal and unremarkable life. He was an accordion and piano player who loved classical music and Italian folk songs, and worked as a music teacher after graduating from college. He had married young, had a son, divorced, and then remarried. In January of 1962, Selak had been in Sarajevo on business and boarded a train back to his home in Dubrovnik. As the train traveled along the Neretva River on a rainy night, it struck a boulder that had fallen onto the tracks and flipped into the water. Landing in the water, Selak grabbed the hand of an old woman who had been sitting near him on the train and tried to swim to shore with his other arm. Just as he felt his strength leaving him, a man grabbed him and pulled him to safety. He suffered a broken arm and hypothermia, but counted himself lucky to be alive, as 17 other passengers had died in the crash. This brush with death would be the first in an incredible series of events in Selak's life. A little over a year later, Selak received a phone call informing him that his mother was ill and in the hospital. Not wanting to waste any time getting to her, Selak boarded a small commuter flight from Zagreb to Rijeka. It was the first and only time in his life he had been on an airplane. During the flight, the back door of the plane malfunctioned and blew open, sucking Selak out the door as the plane crashed, killing 17 passengers, both pilots, and a stewardess. Selak landed in a haystack. He was in shock, but almost completely unharmed. 3 years after that, in 1966, Selak was a passenger on a bus that skidded off a bridge into a river, and although 4 passengers drowned, he swam to shore with only minor cuts and bruises. 4 years later, in 1970, his car caught fire while driving, but he managed to escape the vehicle before the fuel tank exploded. 3 years after that, in another driving incident, his car again caught fire when a malfunctioning fuel pump sprayed the hot engine with oil. Though his hair was singed, he was otherwise unharmed. The next 22 years of Selak's life were accident-free. However, his incredible run of near-death experiences was not over yet. In 1995, he was struck by a bus in Zagreb, but escaped with only minor injuries. 1 year later, in 1996, he was driving his car down a curvy mountain road, and in order to avoid a head-on collision with a United Nations truck, he swerved into a guardrail, which gave way, and he was ejected from his car. He grabbed onto a tree to save himself from falling over the edge, and watched as his car plummeted 300 feet down the gorge. In 2003, 2 days after his 73rd birthday, Selak's luck finally began to change when he won the lottery for 800,000 euros, equivalent to about 1.1 million US dollars at the time. After winning the lottery, he married his girlfriend, his 5th marriage, bought a luxury home on a private island, a boat, and new cars for both himself and his wife. In 2010, at the age of 81, after deciding that money can't buy happiness, he sold the luxury home and moved into a modest home in Petrinja, a small town south of Croatia's capital, Zagreb. He gave most of the rest of his money away to family and friends, keeping enough to live a comfortable life and to be able to afford hip replacement surgery. Speaking about his many disasters, Selak said, "I never thought I was lucky to survive all my brushes with death. I thought I was unlucky to be in them in the first place." When asked about his decision to give most of his money away, he said, "All I need at my age is my Katerina. Money would not change anything. When she arrived, I knew then that I really did have a charmed, blessed life," and added, "I guess all the earlier marriages were disasters too." As of the time of this video, Selak is 89 years old and still resides with his fifth wife in Petrinja. Number 1. Roy Sullivan. Roy Sullivan was born on February 7, 1912, in rural Greene County, Virginia. Like many rural poor in that time period, Sullivan never received much of a formal education. He never graduated from high school, but instead spent much of his childhood outdoors, learning about and living in nature. At some point during his childhood, Sullivan experienced the first instance in what would turn out to be a mysterious, lifelong affliction to lightning. He was helping his father cut wheat when a thunderstorm sprung up and lightning struck the blade of his scythe, leaving him unharmed but setting the field on fire. In 1936, the 24-year-old Sullivan was hired by the Civilian Conservation Corps, which had just begun building Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. Sullivan's duties at this time included demolishing the homes of people who lived on the land that the government had purchased for the park so that the park could return to its natural state. In 1940, Sullivan was hired on with the park's fire patrol. In April of 1942, Sullivan was struck by lightning for the second time in his life. While on duty in the park, a thunderstorm occurred, and Sullivan took shelter in a newly built fire lookout tower which had no lightning rod. The tower was struck several times and eventually caught fire, forcing Sullivan to run outside, where he was struck by a bolt which burned off a half-inch strip of flesh down his right leg and blew his big toenail off. The next 27 years of Sullivan's life were lightning-free. He continued to work at the park, and colleagues remembered him as a character who, unlike many outdoor types, loved people and loved telling jokes and stories. In later years, many new hires to the park held college degrees, but Sullivan outperformed them with his massive knowledge of the outdoors that he had been steeped in since childhood. For example, he was able to identify any type of tree at a glance, even in the middle of winter when they were bare of leaves. He also had a reputation with women. By the time he was 39, he'd been married 3 times. In 1962, at the age of 50, he married 19-year-old Patricia Morris. He would go on to father 3 children with Morris, giving him a total of 4, along with his son from his first wife. In July of 1969, Sullivan was driving his truck down Skyline Drive in Shenandoah Park when lightning struck a tree by the side of the road, jumped to a second tree, and then arced through the open windows of Sullivan's truck to a third tree on the other side of the road, striking him in the head and upper body as it went. The strike knocked him unconscious, burned off part of his hair and eyebrows, and fried his wristwatch. His uncontrolled truck continued to roll down the road, coming to a stop just before the edge of a cliff. This strike was particularly unusual, as the metal bodies of vehicles normally protects the occupants from lightning by acting as a Faraday cage. After this event, lightning strikes began to occur to Sullivan much more frequently. 1 year later, in July of 1970, Sullivan was in his backyard at home when a lightning bolt shot out of a relatively clear sky and struck a nearby power transformer before arcing to his shoulder, searing it and knocking him down. Barely a month later, As he and his wife were hanging clothes out to dry in the yard, his wife suffered a minor strike, but Sullivan, for once, was not hit. 2 years later, in April of 1972, Sullivan was at work in a ranger's station in the park when lightning out of a clear sky struck a fuse box and set his hair on fire. He ran into the bathroom to extinguish it, but couldn't fit his head under the tap, so he had to put it out with wet paper towels. That year, Sullivan made it into the Guinness Book of Records for being struck by lightning 4 times. The first strike, which had occurred when he was a child, wasn't included since he couldn't prove it. By this time, Sullivan, who was reportedly never a fearful or superstitious man, began to feel as though some malevolent force was after him. As his hair had been burned by lightning twice, he began to carry a can of water with him at all times in case it happened again. Some people began to avoid him, particularly if there was even a hint of threatening weather, and this saddened him. Incredibly, even though he had been struck by lightning more times than anyone in recorded history, Sullivan's experiences with lightning were not over. 1 year later, in August of 1973, Sullivan was driving his truck down Skyline Drive, trying to outrun a storm. He was particularly fearful as he'd recently had a dream where he'd been struck again. When he felt that the storm was at a safe enough distance, he got out of his truck to take a look when a bolt shot from the clouds and knocked him down, setting his hair on fire and knocking off his shoe. He crawled to his truck and poured the can of water over his head. Shortly after this incident, Sullivan claimed that he'd had another dream, which he interpreted as God telling him that there would be no more lightning strikes. Sullivan's dream proved to be incorrect. 3 years later, on June 5, 1976, Sullivan was walking down a trail in the park when threatening weather sprung up. Sullivan tried to run, as he claimed he saw a cloud which appeared to be following him, but was struck by lightning again, burning his ankle and once again setting his hair on fire. 5 months later, Sullivan retired from the Park Service. He and his wife moved into a trailer in the small, ominously named township of Dooms, Virginia. He spared no expense on lightning rods, equipping them to all 4 corners of the trailer's roof, the TV antenna, the electric meter, and the 6 tallest trees around the property. On June 25, 1977, a little over a year after his last strike and 7 months into his retirement, Sullivan was enjoying a morning fishing in a pond. Suddenly, he smelled sulfur and felt his hair stand on end, and seconds later he was struck yet again, singeing his hair, burning his chest and stomach, and damaging the hearing in one ear. Dazed, Sullivan made his way towards his truck when he came across a black bear that was in the process of stealing the fish he'd already caught. Sullivan whacked it in the nose with a tree branch, scaring it away, and drove home, where his wife took him to the hospital. In a newspaper interview that fall, Sullivan speculated that some chemical or mineral within his body made him susceptible to lightning. He also predicted that he would be struck again. This prediction turned out to be untrue. Sometime in the early morning hours of September 28, 1983, Sullivan shot himself in the head with a .22 caliber pistol as he lay in bed next to his wife. He was 71 years old. His wife slept through the gunshot, not noticing his death until she awoke the next morning. Some people believe that Sullivan had been suffering from depression, possibly caused or excalibrated by his frequent lightning strikes, which led to his suicide. Many of his extended family claim that Sullivan's marriage was unhappy and find the circumstances of his death, particularly his wife's claim of sleeping through a gunshot, to be suspicious. Sullivan's sister, who died in 2013 at the age of 92, believed until her death that his wife had murdered him. Speculation also surrounds Sullivan's reputation as a ladies' man and one persistent rumor is that he killed himself over an unrequited love. Sullivan can be looked at simultaneously as one of the luckiest and unluckiest people in history. While he was struck by lightning a recorded 8 times, he also survived being struck by lightning 8 times. Thanks so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give it a like. If you haven't already, subscribe and check out my other videos for more content just like it. Thanks for watching.